My overall goal is to provide you with information about how the brain works to encourage or inhibit learning so that you can better advocate for as well as support your child. What I'm going to tell you about may not be new to you. You may have heard these suggestions before, but my hope is that by explaining the foundations for the suggestions about how to support children to learn, as well as understanding the notions of things that can inhibit learning, in terms of the functioning of the brain, you'll have a better appreciation for these tools and techniques that will allow you to not only advocate for your children in their school environment, but also to implement some of these techniques at home. Before I start, I'd like to outline some core concepts about brain functioning that I think is important to keep in mind. First off, and it's important to recognize that the brain is an extremely multifaceted organism. We have over 100 billion neurons or brain cells, and these are all connected intimately with each other to create the functioning organism that we call the brain. The relationship between the neurons or brain cells is both electrical and chemical. So they communicate with each other through electrical stimulation as well as chemical release. My main point here is that there is no isolated learning. So if we're teaching a child to speak, for example, or to read, we can't ignore that the other parts of the brain are working at the same time, and that's an important concept to keep in mind. The second concept that I want to clarify is the notion of the plasticity of the brain. Now, we all know that the brain is relatively plastic and developing when children are young. Originally, until fairly recently, we believed that when the brain became an adult brain, there was relatively little change to that brain. We now know that while the change may not be as drastic, there is still change going on, and the brain has the ability to become more complex with experience and also less complex with lack of experience. So, for example, if a brain is stimulated regularly in a certain way, the neural connections between different parts of the brain that are accessed through that stimulation will become more complex. Similarly, if there's a lack of stimulation, there'll be an atrophying of connections between the parts of the brain that are being that were originally stimulated and are no longer. So when we interact with our environment, our brain changes. When we're born, we basically have what was genetically programmed to be the functioning brain that we start off with, and as we grow and develop and engage with the environment, our brain changes. So not only are we influenced by what we learn, but we're also influenced by how we learn. The final concept that I want to make a quick comment on is the notion of environment. Often when the word environment is put into a sentence, or when we think of the environment, we think of things that are external to us. So I may think of the room I'm sitting in right now, the view out of the window that I'm looking out of, the individuals that are in a room. That would be my external environment. In psychology, when we think of environment, and certainly in terms of the brain and how it thinks of environment, it will add concepts of what is going on external to the individual, but also identify what's going on internal to the individual. So it will take the sum of the external stimulation and the internal stimulation, and that has an impact on learning.